Welcome and good evening. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend this important meeting tonight. My name is Christiana Nelson, and I'll be moderating this evening's Historic District draft presentation and the question and answer forum. Can everybody hear me? Okay. I am an Eastmoreland Neighborhood Association board member. My husband and I have been involved with the ENA for over 5 years at this point. We live in the Berkeley edition. I'm here in my capacity as a board member because the work that I do is for the entire neighborhood and not just towards my own narrow interest. And my husband and I, we became engaged with the ENA to fight against speculative demolition that seemed to be increasing in the neighborhood, and it's been a long campaign since we became involved. The other reason that I'm here tonight is as a resident of the Berkeley edition specifically is I hope to cut a more neutral figure in what has become an intensely controversial issue. For me, Eastmoreland is about what I can provide for my daughter. We have a small home with a yard in a quiet, safe neighborhood. There's not a lot of traffic. We have beautiful parks and trees. We can walk to school. My daughter, she's a fourth-generation Eastmorelander. Our family on my husband's side has been here since the late 30s. Her grandfather started at Duniway in 1939 when it was a K-8 school. Her father, her uncle, both attended. And currently, 2 of her 3 cousins who also live in the neighborhood are attending. The third cousin still in diapers. My point is that despite all the intersections of how and why each of us is here tonight, all of us care deeply about this place that we call home. So let's keep that in mind tonight and going forward, regardless of the outcome of this decision. Before we go any further, I need to make sure that we're very clear on one thing, and that is that we need to be out of this building by 8:30. So out of respect for PPS and their employees, we need to keep on a pretty tight schedule this evening. Hopefully you picked up index cards when you came in. Please use them to write down your questions. We have volunteers that will be moving through the room to collect your cards. And a video is being produced for this evening's event, and it will be made available as soon as we're able. As moderator, I will ask questions of the panel, questions that we have both received prior to this evening's event and questions that will be collected during the forum. In order to run a successful meeting tonight, we'd like to establish some ground rules. These are the rules that we've adopted from Southeast Uplift. Number 1, treat everyone with courtesy and respect. This is a brief overview of our agenda for the evening. At this point, I'd like to welcome Tom Hansen. He's the current president of the Eastmoreland Neighborhood Association. He's going to give a brief talk about the work the Eastmoreland Neighborhood Association has done to bring us to this point.
Okay, so I'm going to give a quick background as how we got here. This was a long road, and it still has a fair length to go. There are lots of people involved in this, and I now know more about city planning, zoning, coding, how to talk to the press, neighborhood politics, city politics, than I ever wanted to know. And I also learned about human behavior and misbehavior at times. Okay, I think the number 1 thing, as Christiana talked about, that got us all started for not only our neighborhood but other neighborhoods was the issue of demolitions. As it says up there, there were 52 demolitions in Eastmoreland area in the last 10 years, if you count the ones that are essentially demolitions. They leave a chimney or a wall or something. So the city doesn't count them, but they are truly demolitions. And the question is, 24 of them were actually in the area that's proposed for nomination of a historic district. I won't go into who benefits, although I can tell you that the people that think they don't benefit are the neighbors who live next to a house which is demolished and then turned into 2. And it's I have to report that just a few days ago, 6 days ago, in fact, the city issued another demolition for Southeast 29th. And this isn't just as I said, just isn't an Eastmoreland issue. This is a citywide issue. Laurelhurst is worried about it. Even Peacock Lane is worried about it because they had one there. Okay. Now this is a brief chronology, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading it to you. I'd just like to point out that it goes back to 2011-12. There was a neighborhood open house which was well attended, not necessarily about the historic district, but about the issue of land use in Eastmoreland. And the board has been preoccupied with land use issues and goals for years. At one time we requested R7 designation, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. The board and the people involved in this project of land use have consulted many people in the last 4 or 5 years. People from the city, preservationists, organizations, archivists, all this kind of thing. So there's been a lot of what I call due diligence. And I personally am not an impulsive guy. Never have been in my career. And I have probably spent as much time agonizing over what to do as anybody in this room. And again, I'm a little, let me say, I'm tired of hearing that this whole historic district thing is a scheme of a few people on the board. That is not true. It has wide-based support from the board, and the board has probably turned over 50% in this period of time. So here's what's been attempted. A planned district was thought to be a good idea, but the city didn't think so. R7 comprehensive plan was also a very good idea for Eastmoreland. We spent a lot of time lobbying the city for that, and they initially said that was probably a good idea, but then changed their mind. I must say that now that Charlie isn't the mayor anymore and is moving out of the neighborhood, one of the things, I got to talk to the mayor twice personally. Once I answered the phone and he said, "This is Charlie Hales." And I said, "What?" Anyway, he personally told me on 2 different occasions that he supports the historic district and hopes it goes through. And I believed him. Okay, the challenges. The comprehensive plan, again, the neighborhood land use people put a lot of effort into the comprehensive plan, but the city decided that they wanted to have a sort of a one-size-fits-all, and that doesn't seem like a good idea for Eastmoreland. Then the residential infill project came along, starting about a year ago, and that was fast-tracked through City Council, and in December passed through City Council, who instructed the Planning Bureau to begin implementation of the proposal. The biggest problem with the infill project that I personally feel is that it has its purpose is to convert single-family neighborhoods into multi-family neighborhoods in the name of density and affordability. It doesn't take into account the context of the neighborhood, the environmental impacts for trees or green spaces, or the historic nature of wherever it takes place. Now, here's a map of the residential infill project put out by them. And I don't know. Do I want to do this? Oh, the blue that circles all the yellow is where the infill neighborhoods are proposed to be. You notice that it's predominantly on the east side. Now, they've been asked that, and they stumble around for why there aren't more west side neighborhoods included, and I don't know the answer to that. One of the key words up here is housing opportunity zones, and that's where they consider the areas that have the biggest opportunity for achieving the goals of the project. Now, I didn't do this, and I'm not really happy about showing it. Another neighborhood did this to sort of show what their neighborhood might look like if all their lots were converted to duplexes with underground garages. But anyway, this is probably something that is likely could not happen in a historic district. The goal of the neighborhood historic district proponents is to be as lenient in the design guidelines as possible. And in talking to the city, they have the same idea. They don't want any historic district czars or police or anything making this a very laborious process for anyone. The goals of most East Side neighborhoods, I think including ours, the board anyway, is to reduce demolitions, to keep Eastmoreland as a single-family owned neighborhood, and maintain the historic nature of this place. Eastmoreland's been historic for 100 years, and hopefully it can be historic for the next 100 years. I know my house is 100 years old almost, and it'll be a great house in 100 years still. Christiana.
At this time, I'd like to extend our appreciation to the dozens of neighborhood volunteers who've worked to support the historic district, to our volunteer coordinator, Joanne Carlson, to our communications team, and especially to the members of the dedicated and hardworking Land Use Committee. We've been at it for a long time. Thank you also to the AECom consulting team, to representatives from the Bureau of Planning Services and the Bureau of Development Services. And finally, for extending your encouragement and support, thank you to the following: the Portland Historic Landmarks Commission, representatives from other landmark neighborhoods, Restore Oregon, and the Architectural Heritage Center. Thank you. Here is a quick view of the agenda from our May 26th workshop. I just wanted to put this out there so we can sort of remember that this has been an ongoing process and we're continuing to pick up the pieces from where we left off. This slideshow from that event and from this one will be available online at eastmorelandhistoricdistrict.eastmoreland.com. And later, you will see that a website will be up on the screen. So again, the video of this evening's event will also be available from the same website. And at this time, it is time to introduce the presentation of the draft nomination of the Eastmoreland Historic District, presented by our consultant team from AECom. Please welcome Kirk Ranzetta and Patience Stewart.
Thank you very much, Kristen. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to the work that's been going on over the past several weeks, if not months. And I, too, just wanted to thank the 40-plus volunteers who assisted our team. It was truly a community effort, and it was something that we took a great deal of pleasure in working with folks, problem-solving together, and coming out with what I think is a good product. The things that we're going to talk a little bit about today involve several different components to the project that we were retained to assist with. It includes the historic property survey, where we did a field analysis of every single property in the Eastmoreland neighborhood, which included Berkeley Addition. We tried to assess each individual property, see if it was contributing or non-contributing. We did establish from that survey district boundaries. Again, that was largely volunteer-led. I think we did kind of a very small minority of the resources, but it was primarily to kind of convey to folks how to do it. The work also included some historical research in terms of trying to establish the historic context and significance of the neighborhood, and then to prepare a National Register nomination to satisfy the state and federal processes that are required for that nomination process. And the last component in our scope was to do design guidelines in terms of working with the ENA and the city sometime in the future if this were to go through.
I'm Patience Stewart. I would like to talk to you about the details and the findings of our reconnaissance and intensive level surveys of the properties in the neighborhood. So the goal of the survey was to record all properties in the survey boundary, identifying key features, materials, styles, and plan types. Our goal is to quantify this data and identify trends in the historic development and its architectural character. And like Kirk said, so much of this was done by volunteers. AECOM went out and surveyed about 100 properties initially to get a sense for the features and materials we would want to look at and train our volunteers on. We went through 2 training sessions with about 30 volunteers for this process, and then sent them out into the field. They recorded the number of buildings on each property, the height, how many stories, the primary and secondary architectural styles, the primary and secondary exterior building materials and the siding, the plan type, so what shape are these houses, other architectural details that have been identified as somewhat unique trends to Eastmoreland. We also looked at the garage. It's pretty evident that Eastmoreland is associated with early automobile development, and so the garage's relationship to the house is a pretty important component. So we looked at where it's placed and how it interacts with the residents. We also recorded landscape features such as basalt rock walls or large street trees. And we also tried to note visible alterations to the property. So anything that would, from a public right-of-way, would impact a property's ability to convey its historic character and association with the district, a proposed district, of course. The survey volunteers took photographs and provided us with the numbers, and they gave their initial take on whether or not each property appeared to be eligible as a contributing property to a potential district. We took all of this data, and this was all thanks to a fantastic volunteer that developed an online data entry program for us, and so everything was uploaded back to our office. And we were able to go through and do a detailed check on all of this data and finalize those recommendations for the State Historic Preservation Office. Here are the results. We looked at 1,561 properties. Almost all of these are residential. Eastmoreland has a number of fantastic landscape and recreational resources, and of course, Duniway Elementary, but primarily it's a residential area. And the architectural styles represent an eclectic collection of European revivals and also American traditions. So European revivals include English cottage, Mediterranean revival, Tudor revival, etc., Spanish colonial, and Dutch influences. And the American traditions, they're kind of typical of Portland, but their concentrations here include craftsman bungalows, somewhat a large concentration of colonial revival properties, and later our more recent past included minimal traditional, very simplified, smaller houses, Cape Cods, and then eventually the ranch style of the mid-century. The data is very clear. Eastmoreland is reflective of an early automobile suburb, and this term is actually important. It'll carry through into the nomination. And it's also evident of the City Beautiful movement, and we see this in the street layout, the landscape features, and the connection to Reed College. Here is a map. It shows the survey boundary, which is outlined in red, which goes all the way out to 39th Avenue, so Cesar Chavez. And then the blue line is the proposed district boundary. So we went out, we looked at everything, and then came back and provided an eligibility on the property. So either is it eligible, does it contribute to the character? Are there alterations that diminish its ability to convey this character and significance, or was it out of period? And for the survey, we looked at everything that was over 45 years old. So anything that was constructed after 1971, we ruled out. And then when we delved deeper down into the research and looked at the data, we actually refined the period of significance and the boundary. So our period of significance based on Eastmoreland's development was refined to 1910 to 1961. This means that there were about 10 years in our recent past, 1961 to 71, that were eliminated from eligibility. And then also a handful of properties, Eastmoreland's oldest residences, were also cut from the potential district. And this is because they predate Eastmoreland's development as a plat. This does not mean that they would not be eligible for the National Register on their own merit individually. There are 7 aspects of integrity that we look at, and I want to make sure that I talk to you about those. And I have to go off the top of my head at the moment. Location, setting, design, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And so these are all aspects that range from everything from very physical to, is the building where it should be originally, to things that are less tangible like feeling, but in a district standpoint, they help really convey the overall character of an area. So we took these aspects of integrity and used them to make a recommendation on eligibility on each of these properties. You see that down in the lower right corner that the Berkeley addition is not part of the proposed district, and I want to talk about that carefully. From the beginning, we were asked to take a really close look at Berkeley, as some of the areas smaller houses, but it's also where a lot of change has occurred recently. Unfortunately, when we went and did the survey, we found that the loss of integrity and the alterations to properties actually diminished the overall character of Berkeley. So there is a higher concentration of not eligible properties in the Berkeley edition that's disproportionate with the rest of the district. So 81% of the proposed district is considered eligible. And I don't know the exact number here, but I think there's more a majority that are not eligible. The dark properties are the ones that are. And we tried to move the boundary around a little bit to see if some properties could be included or not. But when you're dealing with the National Register, you need to justify your boundaries really carefully, and it was really hard to do that here. We were able to cut in, I don't know if there's a pointer. We were able to cut in and include the old Eastmoreland store. And if you want to talk to me afterwards about Berkeley, I'll be at one of the stations at the map, with the maps. And with that, I will pass it back to Kirk to talk about the nomination.
Thanks, Patience. One other group we forgot to thank was the State Historic Preservation Office, too. They're actually here today. They've actually been providing a lot of technical assistance to the nomination over the past couple weeks, and they've also been fielding questions from folks. So just wanted to thank them as well. So the National Register of Historic Places was put in place in 1966 by the National Historic Preservation Act. And all the different components of the nomination have been refined since that time, so that this is kind of the main components of a nomination. One component that I won't get into a ton today is the actual description of the district, but I think that by the time we get to the end, I'll be describing things so you'll kind of have an idea of what is within the district. The period of significance is required by the National Register, and we chose 1910 to 1961 based on a number of different things. Number one, the integrity of the historic district, the patterns of development, and kind of the historical story of the overall community. And what you like to see, or what you usually see in historic districts, is a bit of a bell curve. You see kind of a slow development, a peak at some point when economic times are good, and then a decrease. And you see it in Irvington, you see it in Ladd's Addition, and you see it in a lot of other districts across the country. And that's what we see in Eastmoreland as well, with the main part of the development occurring between 1922 and 1945. There are two areas of significance. One is community planning, and I'll get into that a little bit more, and then also architectural significance too. Yeah. Okay. The other thing that we had to develop quite a bit in the nomination was a historic context, and that is inclusive of kind of dividing up the district into different chronological periods, outlining what the major historical themes are, like community planning and architecture, and then also trying to provide an idea of how the neighborhood developed over time. And within that historic context, one of the most valuable things we had to do was intensive level surveys, where we kind of dive deep into specific properties to kind of get at some very interesting stories behind the early development of the community. So our field work, as Patience noted, resulted in an analysis that resulted in 82% of the resources within the district being contributing resources. So that's a pretty high percentage. I think it's roughly commensurate with what I think was found in Irvington. And another thing that the nomination includes, or something that was attached to it basically, is a multiple property document for historic residential suburbs in the United States. That is this kind of very general, overarching document that was produced by the National Park Service probably a little over 10 years ago that outlined the major themes in suburbia, or suburban development, since the late 19th century. So I noted at the bottom of the property subtype, Eastmoreland as early automobile suburb. Eastmoreland was a community that was intimately developed with the need for transportation. As a matter of fact, the original developer himself laid the tracks for a streetcar to cross over the Bybee Bridge into Eastmoreland to ensure that it would be connected to the broader commuter network of Portland. But what happened is through a number of things, most notably World War I, development was very slow. And what people found was that it's a long streetcar trip into Portland, at least back then it was. It's not quite as fast as it is now. There were a lot more stops. But what happened was a number of key transportation improvements occurred. One in 1923, where East 28th Street was opened, macadamized, and it was easy access to one of a number of different bridges. And then also the Ross Island Bridge was also built pretty soon after that, I believe. I can't remember the exact date. But between those two things, people had a direct route into downtown, and hence it became a very convenient neighborhood for automobile users as opposed to commuters. And so one of the things that we kind of talked a little bit about before was the City Beautiful movement. And Eastmoreland really stands out as one of several different City Beautiful neighborhoods in the city of Portland. One being Laurelhurst, another being Eastmoreland. And they were all developed by the Ladd Estate Company. And they were folks who were very good at kind of stealing ideas from people. So one of the things that we got to look at was some correspondence from the Olmsted family, who were some of the most preeminent landscape architects in the United States at the time. And so Olmsted keeps writing back either to his wife or his brother that, hey, you know, this guy Ladd keeps asking me all these questions, but he's not going to pay me. He's only interested in my ideas and not my services. And he said, I'm gonna knuckle this down. I'm gonna get some money out of him. Well, he didn't. As a matter of fact, Olmsted worked for a number of private individuals on their individual homes, but not on the overall plat for Eastmoreland. It was actually another gentleman who assisted Ladd in the layout. But you can see from the photograph on the left that it had a very interesting grid and meander plan where you had, you know, these rectilinear streets heading north-south and these kind of wavy roads that traveled east-west. During the building boom, what you see is a fairly significant European influence. In addition to why Eastmoreland really boomed was because of those attachments, transportation attachments. And one of the interesting things is that you always read in these kind of architectural general survey books about how architects were influenced by World War I, and you don't really ever hear of a specific story. Well, we found a specific story, and that came from Harold Doty, who designed the Thomas Henry Boyd House, which was built in 1921. He was actually a member of the Camouflage Corps with the U.S. Army, and so what they had to do is basically turn what appeared to be flocks of sheep into batteries of artillery to bomb people. And what you see there is actually a picture of a gentleman in a papier-mâché horse, and he's a sniper. So they came up with all these kind of ingenious things. But one of the things he did was he measured to the inch a house in France, in Longref, France, and he measured it, and he never quite knew what to do with it. Well, a gentleman who was actually the general of his particular unit asked him to design a house after that same house that he had documented in France. And every person who worked on this house, from the architect to the contractors, everybody who hit a nail into that house was a World War I veteran. In the post-war period, you certainly see some degree of change, absolutely, in terms of the architectural style, but you also see some continuity. So the house on your right on Southeast 29th Avenue is a Colonial Revival home that is actually fairly Georgian-inspired. It has a belt course running through the middle of it. It has the very typical five windows up across the top. It's got a little bit of a modern influence with the bay windows on the opposite sides of the front door, but it is this unmistakably Colonial Revival home built in 1951. So that's a pretty late expression of the Colonial Revival. And you also see, less than, 8 years later, Ken Berkmeyer designed this home over on Southeast Martin Street in the Lakeview Addition. It was one of the last big parcels that were developed during that time period. And the reason why I chose the house here from 1936, which is the English cottage home, is because I wanted to kind of show you that the actual form of the homes somewhat remained similar between the 30s and into the 50s, and even 1961 is a little bit different, but you see the expression of the gable coming out, extending out from the front of the house, and you see that again even in the 1950s.
We had so much fun with the research for this project. There are so many great stories that we got to kind of chase down and follow these paths, looking at old newspaper articles, scrapbook collections that your wonderful neighborhood historian, Joanne Carlson, has upstairs, and really found a lot of stories. So part of the intensive level survey process meant we looked at 12 individual properties at a deeper level. So we took a closer look at the architectural details and came up with a more thorough description, a selection that characterizes the neighborhood, and also dove into the histories to look at kind of the social framework and what was happening around development in Eastmoreland. My colleague Shoshana Jones and we did 2 of these, and then the fabulous team of volunteer historians from the neighborhood, they did the remaining 10. And I'd like to just talk about 2 that have great stories. So one is this is the Women's Realty Board model home. It was built in 1931. So Eastmoreland actually served as an epicenter for the Portland Women's Realty Board. This is the first chartered women's board of its kind in the United States. The board formed in 1921 in response to the Portland Realty Bureau's exclusion of women and non-white men from membership, even though at this time women were already leaders in the residential real estate sector. So they essentially said, forget you, we're going to do this on our own, form their own organization. And they worked with Eastmoreland Company and the architect Edward Pape, and they constructed this demonstration house in 1921. Their intention was to promote homeownership, demonstrate sound building and design techniques, and show, as a newspaper article indicates, what can be done for $12,000 in Portland. I think they got a little bit of a deal, but still, we see influences of this house in a number of other properties throughout the neighborhood. Another of our favorites is the Julia Grew all-electric house. So in 1924, Portland High School senior Julia Grew wrote a 600-word essay on the value of good home lighting, and she submitted it to a national competition sponsored by the National Electric Light Association. She won the grand prize of a new $15,000 house. The Ladd Realty Company, they donated the land in Eastmoreland, and they said, hey, this might get some attention. They saw it as an opportunity to highlight the qualities of the neighborhood. It's located on Reed College Place between Tolman and Claiborne. Everyone capitalized on this occasion. They welcomed the public to visit the house for an entire month to showcase the lighting company's work. And while you're there, according to the Oregonian, explore Eastmoreland. At the time, there were only about 1,600 homes in Portland that were heated by electricity. So this is a big deal. And only about 500 had electric ranges and refrigerators. Reports in the Oregonian speculated that over 250,000 people came to see the possibilities of an electric future. By the time Grew started her liberal arts program at University of Oregon in 1926, she had received national acclaim. She had 400 marriage proposals and a film contract offer. And her goal was to become an expert on electrical lighting and interior decorating. Okay, I think it's time to pass it off to Chip, to the State Historic Preservation Office. Diana Painter.
My name is Diana Painter. I am the National Register Coordinator with the State Historic Preservation Office, and I'm here with Jason Allen, my colleague, who is the Survey Coordinator with the State Historic Preservation Office. And we have been working closely with AECOM and others to, this light is really bright, right in my eyes, to help facilitate this process. So we get to do the calculations and the numbers and the facilitation. And so I'm here today just to give you a few key dates. Jason and I will both be available later on to answer specific questions because we just have a few minutes today, or right now, to speak. Just want to get to the page with the dates on it. There you go. Well, we met with the neighborhood in May when the last meeting occurred, and we have now scheduled our hearing before our board, the State Advisory Board, SACHP Board, and we will have the hearing on Eastmoreland on Friday, February 17th from 1 to 4. The day before, we'll have a public tour. The purpose of that tour is to show the neighborhood to our committee. So the public is invited, but we are specifically escorting our committee through the neighborhood. And the people have been quite interested in what happens subsequent to the meeting. We will be revising the nomination based on comments from our SACHP committee. Jason will be incorporating the last changes to the survey. We'll be working with AECOM, and we want to let everybody know that we would like to receive any last-minute changes that people would like to see incorporated and substantiated changes that they need to be by March 1st. We act on behalf of the National Park Service, and we have legislated 90 days after the meeting before we turn in the nomination. If we have a majority of objections to the nomination, it goes into the Park Service as a determination of eligibility. If we have the majority, to put it simply, the majority of support, it goes in as a recommended nomination. We will wait the full 90 days that we're allowed before we send it in, which means that the nomination will be sent in about May 15th. This decision will come out from the Park Service. They have another 45 days. Will come out about July 6th. So we really encourage people. People can send in letters of support and letters of objection all the way till about July 1st. But it would be great if we got them, if they came to us by about May 8th, because then we can tabulate it for the National Park Service. And more information is available on our website. The tiering of the pages is it's Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, Oregon Heritage, National Register, and there's the Eastmoreland Historic District web page that has a lot of this information and other downloads of objection form letters, support form letters, all the materials that Kirk has just talked about just now. And that's kind of the basic broad outline of the process. And you have it outlined there. NPS decision by early July. Would you like to add anything, Jason? You're good? Okay. So we will be available later, and we'll be participating in the panel too for specific questions. So who's up next? Oh, and that's just a diagram of the process and contact information for us. But again, I think you can probably find the web page and contact information more easily by just Googling OPRD, Oregon Heritage National Register.
Thank you. And let's welcome back our consultant from AECOM back up, Kirk Ranzetta. He's going to talk about design review for infill, additions, and renovations before we get to the question and answer panel.
So before we get to the question and answer period, I thought it would be useful to look at several examples of either infill development or renovations to homes that have been approved at the staff level or by, one instance, the Landmarks Commission, which was issued on appeal. So the Historic District Guidelines, so what would happen is what's covered from day one. So there's an existing code. That's the exact reference. It defines the historic review process. And the goal would be to, or option would be to develop historic district guidelines that are specific to the neighborhood. So a number of specific neighborhoods, such as Ladd's Addition, Laird Hill, and several other historic districts, have their own design guidelines that are made specific to the neighborhood. It really helps to kind of let folks know like what specifically should I be aware of in terms of how to go about either a renovation or new development within a certain context. And so what would happen if those design guidelines are put into place would be then that Bureau of Development Services would implement those design guidelines. And very typically, the overwhelming majority of projects are reviewed at the staff level. The Historic Landmarks Commission is only brought into play when there is either an appeal or when the project exceeds a certain dollar amount. I think the dollar amount is over $400,000 or so, something like that. Okay. So, and I think 90 to 95% are handled by staff, roughly? Probably 80%. Okay. So those are the folks that you would largely be dealing with, at least initially, on any kind of new project for your home. So one of the first case studies was for a situation in Ladd's addition of a home that wanted to install a new solar array. And they have a rather slender lot, and the house is gable front to the street. You have an alleyway to the back. And one of the questions that was raised by staff was that they actually said, no, this is not a great approach. The owner appealed, brought it to the Landmarks Commission, and the commission approved it with some alterations to potentially to the overall approach. But what happened was that the solar array was moved sensitively to the rear of the gable slope. From the street side, it wasn't exceptionally visible, so there wasn't a significant visual impact to the overall physical integrity of the home. They had exhausted kind of all the other potential alternatives. They had looked at potentially putting it on the garage, potentially installing it in the backyard, and there just wasn't a lot of options available to the homeowners. And so in this particular situation, a new solar array, I believe, was in fact installed on this home. Another design review case that occurred in Ladd's Addition was the conversion of an existing garage. Ladd's Addition is perhaps really known for its kind of unique alleyways and the garages that are located along those alleyways. And so folks have been fairly busy converting those garages into an ADU. This went through a Type 2 review, it was a staff level review, and this is what the building looked like. Another example of an ADU that was approved in the Irvington Historic District was a garage rental unit expansion. And this basically raised the roof, so to speak, of this particular garage to create some additional space for some occupation. This again, I believe, was a Type 2 review. And again, it was an opportunity to turn the unit into a residential space. And the last example is an example of both an addition of new dormers onto the primary elevation of a home in Irvington, and then they also put on a rear addition. I think what happened in this particular case was that heavy emphasis was placed on really making sure that the rear addition was compatible both in terms of scale and overall design to the remainder of the home. And you can see they obtained a pretty significant amount of additional square footage on the top story in particular. Okay. I'm still doing this part? Okay, yeah. All right, just want to double check. So the goals for historic district guidelines, number one would be to maintain Eastmoreland's unique sense of place. Number two would be to protect Eastmoreland's historic characteristics. The third goal would be to develop clear guidelines for the historic district design review process. And that is perhaps an equally important goal just because it's important for folks to know what is really expected of them even before they get into the process. This is an example, not necessarily what the design guidelines would look like, but it's an analysis that was done some time ago where you have what is what can happen under existing code and what could happen under a proposed code or design review process. This is not necessarily something that is approved in any way, but it's more or less to show you how design guidelines can look, at least in a visual way, to kind of convey some important points that may be required in those guidelines. This is another example, for instance, site coverage. If in fact you do reduce, if you do in fact reduce the percentage of the site coverage, this is what a house would look like. Again, this is something that is not written in stone by any stretch of the imagination, but it's nonetheless provided so that folks can see how design guidelines could be implemented and what they would look like. And again, that whole process is an additional process in working with BDS if the National Register nomination actually goes through. Okay. I think that's it.
Thank you, Kirk. We are now going to start the question and answer panel. Our panelists tonight will be Hillary Adams, who is a historic design review staff for the Bureau of Development Services, Brandon Spencer Hartle, who is a program manager with the BPS Historic Resources. We're going to be bringing up our own Rod Merrick, the land use, the Eastmoreland Neighborhood Association Land Use Committee co-chair, and welcome back Kirk Ranzetta again. We're going to start off with some questions that were sent in prior to tonight's event. If you have your questions ready, raise your hand and volunteers will come around and collect them. They will sort through them, and because our goal in the limited time we have is to answer questions that address as many people's concerns as possible. So to limit duplicate questions, they'll be picking out cards that serve that purpose. Good evening. The first question that we have is, how will the Historic District prevent lot splitting for our larger lots?
I can answer that.
Okay.
It really won't on its own. Land divisions are allowed through another section of the code and they're not subject to historic resource review currently. So I guess the short answer is that it will not stop that. It will prevent potentially demolitions of contributing resources, which I think there have been maybe an occasion or two or more where an older house was demolished so that the lot could be split. So if it's a historic contributing resource, that would be, there wouldn't be an incentive to do that.
I'm going to jump in.
Okay.
I'm going to jump in. I'm with Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and before I jump in to answer the question, we sent a mailing to people in this neighborhood over the last couple of days notifying them of the potential listing of the district. Could people let me know how many people received that letter? Great. Okay, so you've got my contact information on the bottom of that letter, and I'm happy to answer additional questions that we might not get to tonight. So if you have a burning question, Hillary and I work close together, and I can answer those questions if you give me a ring or send me an email. The one piece about demolition that I just want to put out there right up front is that the way our zoning code operates is that if this district were listed and if those 81% of buildings were deemed contributing, they would be subject to demolition review at City Council. Okay. Yeah. Let's see if I can do any of this right. So those buildings that are determined contributing are subject to what's called demolition review. And demolition review is a land use process that ends up at the Portland City Council. So before any of those contributing buildings could be demolished, the City Council would have to approve that demolition. So in theory, we talk about lot splits. That could still happen. It could still happen if a non-contributing building were demolished, or it could still happen on some lots where the contributing building may not occupy the full lot, or there may be the opportunity to divide the lot and retain the contributing building. But it would be difficult, not impossible, but difficult to demolish a contributing building and split the lot and build 2 or 3 houses in its place without approval from the city council. And Hillary's team manages this process. It's what's called a Type 4 land use review, which is a somewhat unique review that is expensive to make application for and is a lengthy process with the city council who, while we don't know whether or not they may approve a demolition. In the past, they have been reluctant to approve most demolition applications that have come before them for historic resources.
Is that not a subjective comment, not an actual metric, though? What is the metric for that?
Which part?
I'm sorry, sir, if you have a question, we can bring a card to you and have you write it down. Okay, we can do that.
I just want to answer that question. I have less information about this in some ways than my colleagues, but I think so that people really understand the impacts, the demolition denial that goes to all the 80% of the houses that are contributing is actually extremely significant. And what Hillary's answer was that in theory, you could split a lot, but in practice, it's going to be extremely difficult. And for non-contributing houses, you know, having the design review process for developers, you know, provides them a tremendous disincentive from speculating in the neighborhood. And so our expectation is that the amount of demolition that goes on a speculative basis would be, it become extremely rare.
Thank you. So we have another question. How much is the historic district nomination going to cost our neighborhood? Rod, would you like to take that one?
I'll try that one. So the board budgeted for the total process somewhere between $55,000 and $60,000 for that process. Sounds like a lot of money, but when you consider how much it costs for each household, we're talking about $50 per house, which doesn't sound like a lot of money for tremendous protections.
Thank you. What are some of the examples of remodeling and repairs that require no special reviews in a historic district?
Was that no special review?
That require no special review.
Yeah, generally repair and maintenance is exempt from review. Painting, we do not look at if you want to paint your house whatever color you want, as long as it's already painted material like wood or trim, we wouldn't look at that. If you have siding that is deteriorated, if it comprises less than 50% of the total wall areas around your house, you could replace that siding with the same exact siding without going through review. There are a few exemptions in the code. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think of them. ADA, accessibility measures, as long as they don't remove historic material, that would be exempt from review. Landscaping, we generally don't look at landscaping. However, if basalt columns are noted in the nomination and changes were proposed to that, we would probably look at that. But generally, we exempt repair and maintenance so that we can encourage preservation of the buildings as they exist to the greatest extent possible.
Thank you.
I want to add one comment to that, if this is on. Is this on? Microphone is not on. Yeah, that's better. So what I think Hillary is telling you is what the baseline review process is. As we've talked about, it's very important that we have architectural design guidelines, which will make it, we hope, extremely clear what is and what isn't included. And as Tom was mentioning, we will lean towards a fairly high degree of flexibility while maintaining the character and integrity of the architecture.
Thank you. Please summarize the distinctions and impacts of residential infill project resulting from approval or rejection of the historic district.
Good question. So I think everyone in this room is familiar with a project of the Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability called the Residential Infill Project. The Residential Infill Project is in the concept refinement and zoning code language drafting process. So for those of you who were paying extra close attention, in December the City Council adopted a concept for how we would manage growth and uses within our single-family zones. Most of Eastmoreland is in a single-family zone. That concept would reduce the scale and allowed height of houses that are currently allowed, and also open up opportunities to add additional dwelling units on sites that today may only allow one house and an ADU. Part of that concept would allow for the internal conversion of existing single-family houses into multiple dwelling units citywide, and allow for new duplex and or triplex construction within a geography that's still to be determined that may or may not include Eastmoreland. So the concept of the residential infill project is to reduce the allowed scale of houses, and that's not to say that it's going to reduce the size of houses that you might be seeing built in Eastmoreland, but reduce what's allowed in the zoning code, where today it would be allowed to build, you would be allowed to build something on the magnitude of a 6,000 square foot house. Under the concept, that house may be limited to about 2,500 square feet. With that would come, in some areas, the ability to do multiple dwelling units. If you became a historic district, whatever is allowed in the base zone, whether that's a duplex or a triplex or an accessory dwelling unit, would still be allowed with the historic district. But with the historic district, you'd be subject to historic resource review or design review to ensure that changes or new construction was compatible with the district as a whole. Also, the reduction in allowed house size would still apply to the historic district, so you would not see proposals to build houses that would be allowed today to be 6,000 square feet. You may see proposals for 2,500 square foot houses still subject to historic resource review. So if your interest in the historic district is to stop things like duplexes, that's not going to happen with the historic district overlay. That duplex either is going to go into a contributing building, or it's going to be a new construction project subject to historic design review.
I beg to differ on that because for several reasons. One is what Brandon's saying is in essence true. There's no argument with what is technically possible. But the fact is that putting triplexes on the corners essentially requires demolition. The other thing that the Bureau continues to attempt to claim is they're limiting house size to 2,500 square feet. Actually, they're not. And the slide that Tom showed of duplexes on every 50 by 100 lot is what would be allowed under the residential infill project. And those houses that we independently analyzed what's allowed, and when you include the basements, a raised up basement and a half attic, you get closer to 4,000 to 5,000 square feet. So yeah, we're not going to build 6,000 square foot houses, but we're going to see 4,000 square foot houses, which is bigger than almost any of the houses in Eastmoreland now. So you really, this claim that it's going to reduce scale is actually a very false claim, and one that has not been carefully examined by the Bureau.
Thank you.
And I just want to say allowed size is different than what we're seeing built today. The average size house is not always maxing out the allowance for size, but today we allow a very large house to be built, and in some neighborhoods we do see those very large houses. So the residential infill concept is to reduce the allowed scale, which is our intent. It doesn't necessarily mean that we'll be creating brand new small tiny houses.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that the you know, a duplex could be built on every 50 by 100 lot under the residential infill project. But again, if you have to tear down a contributing house to build one of those duplexes, it's not going to happen. What you could do, what we could see, if the neighborhood changed in character in some way in the future, is people subdividing their houses. I mean, this is a very difficult and complex process. Very few people are going to undertake it, but it is theoretically possible. So, and the same thing is true with the triplexes on every corner. And the same is true with the combination of the house plus 2 duplexes that would be allowed under the residential infill project.
Thank you. I want to improve energy efficiency in my house, especially the windows. Will this require an extensive review and limit the kinds of windows I can use?
This is probably one of the most common questions that we get. Again, we implement the Historic Resources Code, which the purpose of which is to preserve historic materials and historic character. So in order for us to approve removal of historic windows, we generally ask that the applicant shows that they're deteriorated beyond repair. Sometimes they really are just shot windows, and approval of that is relatively easy. But we encourage replacement with wood windows. Sometimes maybe we can get there with aluminum clad wood. We have approved fiberglass on relatively newer buildings or non-contributing buildings. We have not approved vinyl windows on historic buildings. There are a number of things that you can do and a number of resources that you can find to help you restore your wood windows and make them energy efficient on the interior that doesn't actually remove exterior historic character.
Thank you. If I'm a member of ENA and support the historic district, do I still need to submit a letter that I support, that I'm in favor of the proposal?
Support letters are always welcomed, I think, by both the State Historic Preservation Office as well as the National Park Service. It does not necessarily count as a vote, though, principally because the only votes that are actually counted are the no votes. So if that makes any sense. But I think that, yeah, I think that it's important for folks, regardless of how you feel about the project, to let your ideas be known to both the State Historic Preservation Office as well as the National Park Service.
Okay, we have another question. Why does it have to be a district designation instead of just by property? It's a very difficult process to individually list 1,500 homes or to do them in kind of isolated pockets. Eastmoreland developed as a unit over time on a plat that exhibits some fairly unique City Beautiful movement ideas. And so the district, if you look at the Park Service's National Register Bulletin, the resources have to have certain associations historically. They have to retain integrity. And there needs to be kind of a unifying story to the neighborhood. And I think in all 3 of those cases, at least as far as the research carried us, that was the case. But for those folks, for instance, who have homes built before 1910 or built after 1961, you can absolutely list your home on the National Register if you so desire. Thank you. How do we get review guidelines prior to, do we get review guidelines prior to May 8th? And the second question is, how are guidelines changed or updated when new technologies are invented? We're looking for answers that regard things we can't predict, i.e. conservation and energy efficiency.
I'll jump in first, and then I'll hand it off to Hillary, I think. So guidelines are a very specific way to implement what we call historic resource review. So generally, if you became a historic district, you would be subject to historic resource review. Guidelines are a district-specific document that serve as the approval criteria for changes. So I think that the question was asking about the historic resource review when just the act of the city reviewing applications to alter, demolish, or create new buildings in the historic district. And I think the first part of the question was, can they become effective early, or
Will the review guidelines be available prior to May 8th?
the review guidelines? So the review guidelines that would become effective automatically upon the listing of this district in the National Register are in the Portland Zoning Code, Chapter 846-060G. And I can answer that question in an email if you want me to with a link. That becomes effective automatically. The design guidelines that would replace those approval criteria that would be specific to Eastmoreland to capture your specific building types and issues here would be something that was done in the future.
Anyone want to add anything?
So I think the question I was going to ask Brandon is how soon in the future. If he doesn't want to answer it.
Well, what I'll say Irvington was listed in the National Register 6 years ago, and they do not have district-specific design guidelines, and the sky hasn't necessarily fallen. That said, we do have a comprehensive plan policy that was adopted by City Council in June that does say we will adopt and update district-specific design guidelines for our historic districts. So those of us at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, while we're happily taking all of your calls, didn't budget in our time and kind of financial budget to start writing district-specific design guidelines for a district that we don't know will exist. So that's a bridge we'll cross after we find out what happens with the district.
I think the other part of that question that we haven't answered is, are design guidelines forever? And I think the answer to that is no, they are not forever. They take a good deal of work to change, but I'm going to leave that to Brandon or somebody else to clarify.
Well, for perspective, there was a set of guidelines adopted for the Skidmore Old Town District, I believe, in the 70s or 80s, and they were just improved upon and adopted finally last year. So you kind of want to get it right the first time.
Thank you. Can we still fight the residential infill project, or is it a done deal at this point?
I would say that the phone calls we get every day at the Planning Bureau would say that it's not a done deal. We do have 2 new elected leaders in Portland who were not part of the drafting of the concept report for the residential infill project. We have been briefing the mayor and new city commissioner on the project. We are in the process now of drafting zoning code that will go through a public process both at the Planning Commission and at the City Council later this year, where your testimony will certainly be invited. And because of the significant areas of uncertainty coming out of the concept report, such as where new duplex and triplex construction will be allowed, what specifically the allowed size of houses will be, other questions about design controls, those were not answered. So I can guarantee there will be a robust public process that you will all know about later this year.
And I'd like to ask a follow-up question about the residential infill and historic district. You'd mentioned earlier that it is still possible to demolish homes under a historic district. How much does that change under the residential infill project if the historic district is not in place?
So the question is, if you choose the route as a neighborhood of not listing in the National Register?
If we're not
happens?
listed, so understanding there is some, whether even if it's a small chance, of still having demolitions happening into historic properties in the neighborhood, that's still possible in a historic district. If the historic district is not approved and not adopted, what is the difference between demolitions in a historic district and demolitions in this neighborhood not protected by a historic district under the residential infill project?
Well, it's a good question. One of the intents of the residential infill project is to reduce the rate of demolition for buildings that otherwise are viable. So we're not going into the project hoping to increase demolitions. That said, I can't really predict exactly what would happen other than to say there would not be demolition review if you were not a historic district. There wouldn't be additional demolition requirements. And so that'll be a question of the specifics of what's allowed and how the kind of market economics work out in your specific neighborhood. We do believe that reducing the allowed scale and height of houses may take some pressure off of interest in demolishing buildings. Again, it doesn't come with the same certainty. If you're really interested in demolitions, the historic district protection is the strongest tool that we have to limit demolitions. Of course, it comes with all of the other pieces of the puzzle that we're talking about tonight.
Yeah, I think the thing to keep in mind is that again, it's the scale issue. Whether the intention was to limit demolitions or not, the allowable scale under the residential infill project actually allows larger houses than most of the houses in Eastmoreland. So if you're wondering whether somebody's going to come in and demolish houses and build larger ones, continue to do so, the answer is absolutely. There's absolutely nothing that will slow down the redevelopment as a result of this. And I think the economic analysis, the independent economic analysis that was done that you can read about on our website will support that.
Thank you. I have a question that's directed specifically for Mr. Ranzetta. How are the home examples used in your slide contributing or non-contributing? Or excuse me, are they contributing or non-contributing?
I think in the case of specific case of the Women's Realty Board house, I believe that was contributing. That certainly had a high degree of integrity. I believe the house, the World War I house, may be non-contributing because there was a significant addition placed onto the side of that home. I'm thinking back to the one slide of the home that had like a stone foundation or stone base to it that had a kind of the hints of a thatch roof. That is contributing. The kind of more modern Berkmeyer house, I believe, was contributing. And that home that was below it, built in 1936, and also the Georgian house, I think they were also contributing. Yeah.
Thank you. Earlier this fall, I heard that a homeowner could attach something to their house which would prevent the lot from ever being split. Is that true? And if so, how do I go about attaching that condition to my house or lot?
It is true. We have, as a neighborhood, offered a code and covenant that would prevent lot splitting on your particular property. It's an individual covenant that would be filed with the county that would basically, state what you would allow for your house and all future owners of that property. We have a number of houses that have that attached to them. It's not widespread at this point. We're hoping to find a more universal solution to what we're facing, but it is certainly one of the options that the Neighborhood Association has offered.
Just to add a little historical side note, the community of Irvington actually tried that very same idea starting in the 1920s when the original covenants on the properties in Irvington came up for renewal, or when they sunset, basically. So it's something that's been around for a very long time. So.
How will a historic district affect our property taxes?
I can't answer that.
I can't answer that in a defensible way other than to say that if you look at our state's property tax limitation measures, the imposition of a historic district doesn't in and of itself change your property taxes. Where things may change is Oregon does have, and I only mentioned this briefly, but I can talk more about it later. Oregon does have a property tax special assessment program for properties that are individually listed in the National Register or contributing in historic districts. So for those individuals who are considering a more major project that would respect the history of the house and sensitively make alterations or improvements, you are eligible to enroll in a 10-year property tax special assessment program, which is intended to reduce your property tax liability over the course of 10 years to help compensate you for the work that you've done rehabilitating and or restoring your house. So we do have a nexus between historic designation and a program which is intended to reduce and or stabilize your property taxes if you're intending to do a larger rehabilitation or restoration project.
Yeah, I don't have any special knowledge about this, but I can report that the question has been asked of some of the Irvington land use folks, and their response is that it doesn't have any identifiable impact on their taxes.
I have a question about demolitions. Can you define demolish as opposed to remodel? 2 houses on our street, 34th and Rex, were demolished, leaving a small wall, but were called a remodel.
Whoever asked that question, can you shout out what year that happened in? Last year. So in April of 2015, the City Bureau of Development Services changed the definition of demolition to not allow for the one wall standing type demolitions that we were seeing so many of. Since that time, it's our understanding that if it looks like a demolition, it's usually a demolition permit now, and if it looks like an alteration, it's usually an alteration. In that change to the building regulations, we were very intentional about thinking about how we could ensure that from sort of the public realm, a building that isn't demolished but is altered doesn't end up looking like a new building at the end of the day. We can talk more afterwards. I don't want to get into the specific about perimeter wall area and replacement of basements and what amount of exterior wall area is retained. But from the city's vantage point, there was just a report given to City Council last week. We believe that we have closed the loophole that allowed for the one wall standing situation. There may be examples that I'm not aware of, but as a general statement for about the last year or a little longer than a year, we've been seeing things much more straightforward about what is and what is not a demolition.
Thank you. How do I find out if my house is contributing, and if it isn't, can I appeal?
There's actually a whole series of maps outside where folks can check on their individual properties. There's also a map on the SHPO website that shows the contributing and non-contributing resources. For those folks who believe that there was an error either on their main house or on the garage, for instance, in terms of whether or not they believe it's contributing or not, one way or the other, we have requested, and I think it was on one of the slides, that folks try to get it in to either the ENA or Keep Eastmoreland Free folks by March 1st. And the reason why there's that timeline is because we wanted to provide folks the opportunity to first of all see the SACHP meeting and to kind of see the materials and information, to kind of digest it, review it, make sure that it's correct, or if it's incorrect, to provide either one of those organizations with the applicable information. And we, meaning AECOM, will make our best recommendation to the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office to make sure that those corrections are made. We have received some requests for changes, and I think that we have, positively accepted most of the requested changes. There are a couple of instances where we didn't. But I would suggest that if you do think that an error was made, I really encourage you to get a hold of or to supply that information to either one of those organizations, and it'll get to us. We'll make our recommendation and then forward it on to the State Historic Preservation Office.
Thank you. I have another question that just came in that's specifically for you. It says, Mr. Ranzetta, thank you for clarifying contributing versus non-contributing regarding Eastmoreland. Was the home in Lad's addition with the roof raise contributing or non-contributing?
I don't know the specifics. Was that a project that you reviewed? Or?
I don't know what project is being referred to.
It was a land use review, probably done within the past 5 years. Type 2, I believe, that raised the roof on a back building in Lad's addition.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay.
I looked at some of those slides that you presented, but I didn't really recognize any of them. Generally, if a roof is going to be allowed to be raised another level, it would be on a non-contributing resource, not a contributing resource.
Do you not, I mean, those both look like contributing resources by any normal stretch of the imagination. The ones that you cited, were they?
I don't know. Like the one garage that was the one story, I believe, was contributing because the alterations were pretty sensitive to the resource. And I think the other one was probably additional flexibility allowed given the context of the location of that particular building. If my memory does not escape me, I believe it was located right next to like Division or one of the commercial areas that had rather tall buildings. And so the garage may not have, like the house may have been contributing, but the garage may not have been. So that's the best I can recollect right now.
Would an Eastmoreland Historic District, would our specific guidelines for Eastmoreland Historic District overrule Portland's Historic District guidelines?
So Hillary and I can both speak to this. If you had district-specific design guidelines, those would become the approval criteria for changes in this historic district. That said, those guidelines are not something that are just adopted out of thin air. They have to be vetted by the Portland Historic Landmarks Commission and adopted by the Portland City Council as land use approval criteria. So it's not as though those of us here at the table will draw on a napkin what the design guidelines are. There is a lengthy public process to ensure that those guidelines are the right guidelines for your district.
I agree with what Brandon said. It's simple.
Okay. I read on Nextdoor that a local historic district that will be allowed under Goal 5 reform would be a better fit than a national historic district listing for protecting our neighborhood from demolitions. Is this true or not?
I'm going to give a very long answer, so bear with me. Currently today, to create a local historic district or a conservation district, which we might consider preservation light, we can only create those with 100% owner consent following a 1995 statute passed by the legislature. So Oregon is the only state that requires unanimous owner consent for local historic designations, which means for the last 20 years, we have not advanced any local historic districts here in the city of Portland. I'm gonna get really wonky on you. There's a land use planning goal number 5, that directs cities and counties to protect and conserve historic resources. There's a group of us who have been working on a rulemaking committee to create the implementing rules for jurisdictions around the state on how to meet that land use planning goal number 5. One of the pieces of the proposal, and this is just a proposal, would be to allow for the creation of local and conservation districts with the support of a majority of property owners. That proposal is up for a hearing tomorrow at 8:30 in the morning out in St. Helens. There may or may not be a decision made tomorrow. That hearing may be continued. There are still a number of questions about whether or not this is something that can happen. If the decision is made at the state to allow cities to create local and conservation districts, we at the City of Portland don't have a process to create those local and conservation districts, nor do we have exactly the right level of regulation to apply a preservation light designation. So if the state gives the City of Portland the green light to create local historic districts, viably create local historic districts, we would have to rewrite sections of our zoning code, which I think many people in this room realize takes a long time. We would have to rewrite sections of our zoning code to be able to consider and apply regulation to potential future local and conservation districts. I do want to say one more thing, and this is something that maybe there'll be questions about. Another piece of this hearing tomorrow in St. Helens is considering how cities apply historic resource review to new listings in the National Register. Today, we at the City of Portland automatically apply demolition review and historic resource review to any new listing in the National Register. The proposal in front of the state tomorrow would be to continue to apply automatically that demolition review piece, the part where a property owner has to go to City Council to get permission to demolish, but would require a separate process before historic resource review is applied to new listings in the National Register. That's a long-winded way of saying it may be for an Eastmoreland historic district that there's not the automatic application of historic design review, that there would have to be a separate local process that the City of Portland would manage to apply historic resource review. And I don't mean to throw a wrench into everything you've been thinking about with your support and opposition of a district, but we may know more tomorrow from the state as to whether or not that's a different path than we've followed for the last 20 years that we'd be following going forward. So as we've talked about this historic resource review, that is the situation today in our zoning code, but there is a possibility, and probably a greater than possibility, there's a proposal in front of the Land Conservation and Development Commission to bifurcate historic resource designation on the National Register from the automatic application of design review. What that might mean is a couple of things. It may mean that in a matter of months, we come back and propose the idea of applying what already exists in the zoning code, the base historic resource review approval criteria to your neighborhood. It may mean that we wait until district-specific design guidelines are drafted for your neighborhood before we begin that process. We don't know because we're waiting to find out what direction we get from the state to start to invent that process. What we do know is it will take us at least a year from now to have a new process in our zoning code to apply historic resource review. So if the state says, City of Portland and cities around the state, you can only apply historic resource review after a separate public process following designation, we would be looking at least a year out before we initiated a process to do that. I see lots of question mark bubbles above people's heads, and that is totally understandable. If a decision is made tomorrow, and or when a decision is made at the state level on these administrative rules, we will be posting about it on the city's website. And since I know many people in this room are tenacious Nextdoor followers, you will probably see something on Nextdoor before I even know about it.
I'm going to throw my 2 cents in on this. I think the answer to that question is that in terms of the benefit to this neighborhood, there's really no benefit to becoming a local historic district when and if it ever happens. I mean, that is a big, big if. the city has to fund this project that Brandon is saying could happen within a year. The chance of that happening is, it's always possible, but it's very, very unlikely. So I think the more likely impact on our historic district would be the when and how we establish the design guidelines. And that, you know, I don't think we have a serious concern about that as long as we're moving forward in that direction. So I think the simple answer is the local historic district is really a bad idea for this neighborhood and would not be helpful at all.
And I'm gonna jump in and just say one more thing, and that you have a really cool neighborhood, and you wouldn't be here tonight if you didn't have a really cool neighborhood, and you have a lot of really smart neighbors who care about this, either in support or in opposition. And so I think now is a really good opportunity, if you haven't made your mind up, to go into the library and talk to Keep Eastmoreland Free, to stick around afterwards and talk to the proponents of the historic district, and to learn more about what all these processes mean, because not this many people would turn out if it wasn't really important, and we at the city are trying to do our best to get you clarity on these administrative rules. We will be asking the state tomorrow at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability to adopt those rules tomorrow so that we can give you certainty. That said, our hope is to keep providing you as much quality information as you can so you can talk with your neighbors and make the right decision for what you know today or in the next several months is happening in your neighborhood and what decision you'd like to make going forward. And we'll try to get you as much information as we know, but I do feel a little guilty telling you there's a lot that we don't know in terms of what these other options might look like in the future.
Thank you, Brandon. That's a steep learning curve. I don't think I made it to the top. I'd like to also add to your comment that there's a third group out in the hall called HEART, stands for Historic Eastmoreland. I'm not sure I remember the entire acronym, but you can Achieving Results Together, and they're wonderful. They're not at all associated with the Eastmoreland Neighborhood Association, but they're there as well to help you find the information you need to make a decision. So I have a two-part question. Can you add dormers and/or decks to the back of the house? And is the city more lenient in review on alterations made to the sides and backs of houses?
I would say yes to both. We generally encourage, if you want to make alterations, that those be located at the rear or on the sides of the house. We've approved plenty of dormers and additions on the rear. We like to work with applicants and architects and homeowners to try to find the right solution for your specific house so that your alterations or additions are in keeping with the character of that house and don't overwhelm the existing building. But yes.
Thank you. How does the historic district affect any Duniway school remodels or expansions in the future? Who pays for the design fees? And because it is a public building, does this complicate the process?
So I would assume that this building would be a contributing resource in the district and may even be a landmark. Is it? It's a landmark? Great. So it is already subject to historic resource review for alterations and expansions. Portland Public Schools would be responsible for those fees.
Thank you. Is it possible for me to access the survey results info for my particular property?
In addition to the maps outside, in the nomination itself, there is an appendix that includes information about every individual property that was recorded within the historic district boundary. So yes, and that is located in several different places. First place I'd point you to is to the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office and their website. They have something dedicated to the district and the nomination itself. And if it comes out usually as a PDF document, and if you go to the Find looking for your address, just type in the number to your home, and hopefully it should just pop up, and you should be able to find it a little bit easier than having to scan through a couple hundred pages of individual properties. And so that's probably the easiest way I can tell you to do it, or to look at the map that's outside. As a quicker version, it's just going to tell you contributing, not contributing. But if you want the specific details of the survey information, it's actually in the nomination text.
How does a historic district affect values of our homes? The home value.
I'll jump in to say there's a body of research that suggests that historic designation may stabilize to a greater degree property values in areas that aren't designated because of some additional certainty that may come with it. Also recognizing in a district setting, you have a better sense of what's going to happen with your neighbors than you would outside of a district. There is some competing research that says that historic districts end up having slightly higher property values than comparable areas that aren't designated. There's also research that just suggests that during recessions and boom times, there's a little less fluctuation. But I'll let Hillary or Kirk jump in. But we do see different things.
I don't have anything to add to that.
And Kirk has run away from the stage. Well, one thing I think, absolute values are one issue, but there's another value that I think is particular to Eastmoreland, and I don't think we're unique in the city, but we have a very wide variety of housing sizes in the neighborhood. And one of the things that redevelopment, including that under the residential infill project, would do is to typically elevate those housing sizes. And typically elevating those housing sizes drives up the price of what you buy. So one of the things that the Historic District will do from our perspective, that is the ENA board perspective and the research that we've done, is that it will maintain the variety of house types, sizes, and values in the neighborhood, which not having an historic designation will tend to push those values up and tend to encourage mansionization, those 4,000 square foot, if you want to call that mansionization, but definitely larger, the trend is towards larger new houses, and if it's not protected, that trend will very much influence this neighborhood in the future.
Thank you. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions, depending on how long the answer takes. The examples shown were all Type 2 reviews. How much does a Type 2 review cost?
Generally, the land use review fees are based on the valuation of the project. It is whatever the project valuation is times 0.032. There's a minimum threshold that we require. Our purpose is to recoup fees or recoup the costs of going through the review and the mailings and such. There are also, depending on the scale of the project, there are additional Service Bureau fees, BES, water, fire, life safety, transportation. They may review a project depending on the scale. But I just calculated these numbers yesterday for somebody else, and I believe generally a minimum you're looking at is, there is the Type 1, which is $250. But the Type 2 will probably start at around just about $1,000, give or take. And then the maximum, if you were proposing a very large expansion of your house, that I think would have to cost about $164,000 or more, that could get you up into the maximum fees, which exceed $5,000. So generally, most for type 2 reviews that we see are right around the $2,000 range or less.
And I don't have anything to add to that except to say that Hillary did a wonderful job of answering this question and many others like it about the costs and review time that are in the question and answer section of our Eastmoreland Historic District website, which I hope you all take time to review as the #1 source for vetted information and non-rumor information.
We have time for one last question. Once a historic district is approved by the National Park Service, but before design guidelines are in place, can demolitions of any kind or construction, or any kind of construction, demolitions or any kind of construction take place?
So a demolition of a non-contributing resource would still be allowed outright. You would just have to get a demolition permit from the city. But once the nomination is adopted and the district is created, then demolition review applies. So you would have to go through that process. If you submitted an application today for a demolition, and then the historic district was approved and came online later, you would be vested for those demolition rights. Currently, anything can be demolished with a demolition permit unless it is a landmark. In this area, I mean.
If one thing you could do that would be helpful to me, I get a lot of phone calls and questions, but if there are people in the neighborhood who, whether they're for the historic district or opposed to the historic district, if there are common questions that are coming up in the neighborhood that you'd like to see us respond to on the city website because you're concerned that one side or the other side may not have all the information, just ask us to do it. And I think I'm just saying that because I know that there is a lot of concern about misinformation. I think we can answer those questions. And I want to make sure that both Hillary and I, and primarily me, since I put my number on that letter, we're available to answer those questions that come up because we want people to make a decision that you feel good about and that you feel like you do have all the information. So do feel free to give me a call. We can try to get you the best answers, and we'll try to put as much as we can on the website if questions, especially related to this rulemaking Goal 5 stuff come up, to try to make sure everyone has good information, because we really don't, at the Planning Bureau, we really do want to make sure that while we do not play a role in whether or not this moves forward or gets designated, we do want to make sure that whatever the outcome, people feel like they did have access to all the information they needed. So if you just Google search Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, you'll see a Historic Resources tab. And after I get some certainty on these rules, hopefully tomorrow I'll start posting things related to what we don't know tonight that we may start to get certainty on.
This is the website where you can find the slides and the video that was made tonight. Thank you all for participating. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for remaining respectful to one another. And again, they are turning off the lights at 8:30. Have a good evening.